Actually, you know what, we'll set it to 1. So we'll want to show some of the cool binding stuff. Great. And then what we'll do is we'll export that as part of our data context. So if I do data, app.context.data equals winjs.binding.as of our data object. So we've now exposed that as an observable proxy. And so now the way that we wire up our declarative binding is with our binding processor. So very similar to our control processor is our binding processor. That lives in the binding namespace. And so I just call process all. And then I apply null here, so that just means, hey, let's do this over the entire DOM. And then I'm going to pass in that context. And so hopefully with all of the correct magic, when I hit output, we'll see if this actually worked. Great, it worked first time, awesome. You'll see that we have our rating. Instead of statically defining it in our options in our HTML, and actually you can see, look, it actually overwrote our initial value of 2, and so we actually know that binding is actually working. Let's just do another small test just to ensure that it's actually working. So we're going to have a button here. And we're going to actually data bind to it as well. And so that's the nice thing about WinJS is once you understand that you can just bind to any JavaScript property, then you can apply these bindings not only to our JavaScript controls, but also to all of the intrinsic HTML controls as well. And so what we're going to do here is I'm going to do a data when bind, and we're going to bind to the on-click property of this button. And we're going to bind that to our event handlers that we had in the previous context. And I believe I called it add1. And so I'll just give this button a label. And so now if I go back into our script, we have our add1 event handler in our event handler namespace here. And then all I'm going to do here is update that observable proxy that we exported here. And so now if I just call app.context.data.rating, which is our rating control, or rating property, mind you, and if we just do a ++, hopefully when we run the output and I click this button, you can see the value of that rating control going up, which is great. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to end this demo. So this is the simplistic, basic kind of building blocks of WinJS. And now Edgar is going to take those concepts and he's going to expand those out to the various JavaScript controls that we have in WinJS, and what he did in our Cordova sample to bring a WinJS application cross-platform. So let me switch back to the slides here to give us a little bit more context for everyone. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Edgar, and he's going to talk about all the fun stuff that we've done with the app stock sample.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. So next, let's take a look at my screen. And this is the application that we're going to be building. It's a sample stocks app. Many of you may be familiar with this UI. We actually released a version of this application as part of the Windows 8 developer preview. And now we're using the code to create a Cordova app now that WinJS is cross-platform. Something that I want to call out is the code is available in GitHub, so you guys can go and dig into the code and open issues or ask questions, and we will be happy to answer. So before we build this app, let's take a look at 4 main controls that are going to be the core of this stocks app. First is the list view. The list view control is one of our most popular controls, and it handles displaying large amounts of data, and it visualizes the elements of the DOM. It supports multiple layouts, grouping, edits. It handles all the animations when the data source changes.
And it handles mouse, keyboard, touch, all of those things too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's one of the main controls. Next, we will be using an app bar control. One interesting part about going cross-platform is that when we were in Windows 8, we used to have these app bar commands using symbols from Seagull UI. And as soon as we went cross-platform, we decided to open source a web font that includes the main and extended set of icons. And it allows different controls, such as the app bar, the nav bar, to be able to refer to those icons and work in Android, in iOS, and in platforms that don't necessarily have the Windows Seagull UI font. You can also use it in your own custom content, as this sample shows.
Cool. And that's on our GitHub, right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Cool. So now let's take a look at the code. This is the application running in the simulator. The main control here is the pivot control.
Right.
The pivot control has different events that allow the application to know whenever the selection change, and then we are able to display different content. It also manages making sure that there is only one view displayed at a time. The pivot control is, let's take a look at the structure of this page.
Right. But this is actually a Cordova application, right?
Exactly.
This isn't a web page. You're actually running WinJS inside of Cordova, targeting iOS.
Exactly. You can imagine that you are able to use the Visual Studio to create the Cordova, right, the multi-device hybrid application, or you can use the command line Cordova create stocks app, and then in this case we're using iOS, so we created the folder structure using the command line, and then we reference WinJS. WinJS is, you can create your own custom build of WinJS, or you can include the entire WinJS. There is one mail style sheet that reference all the styles and rules for the controls that we'll be using, as well as the reference to a web font that we need for different platforms.
Awesome. So this is just a regular Cordova application using WinJS is just like a regular JavaScript library.
Exactly.
Perfect.
So first, let's take a look at the main structure of the main, kind of like the main element of the index.html. It contains a pivot control. The pivot can be configured to have a title, which we see like right here. Then there are different items. There is a watch list, there is a market section, and there is a news section. We'll drill down later into the content of those items. You can pretty much put any content you want. In our scenario, we happen to put these views in the 3 tabs.
Right.
Below, we also see that there is functionality to add to search for different stocks and add it to your watch list. And then towards the bottom, we will see an app bar, which allows you to list all the commands that we will be using in the different tabs, like add, edit, delete. The markets has an option to toggle between list and grid. And we will detect in the pivot control when we are in a given tab and show only the commands that are appropriate for that specific scenario.
Cool.
So
the actual markup that you're showing here is using those exact same concepts that we talked about earlier, where you're using data win control to instantiate your app bar, you're passing it some data through the options. That's great.
Absolutely.
So all of our controls follow that same pattern, the same model. So if you learn it for one, it applies for all of the other ones that we have.
Correct. So let's take a look at at one of the tabs in this pivot control. So let's take a look at a simple one, the news one. You can see that we have a list view. 2 of the main, as Paul mentioned, you can specify options, right, for the control, so that when process all is invoked, it uses these settings. 2 of the main ones for the list view are the item data source and the item template. The item template indicates what every item is going to look like. So for instance, in this case, we're using a news item template, which is defined here, and is using binding again. And then there is a title, which is this top section, and then there is a description, which is a preview of the article. The item data source, we use in this scenario a binding list, which is a proxy to a list, and it allows you to simply have data in an array and be able to do edits, and it handles sending the notifications to the list view to handle animations, etc.
Right. So we have observable objects and we have observable arrays in JS as well.
Exactly.
And you could have observable arrays with observable objects inside of that as well.
Right.
Cool.
That was a simple item template that you can go as complex as you want. In this case here, we can see for the watch list, is using a watch list item template, which contains a canvas that is used to throw this chart, and then stock details, which is the section that includes all the information about this particular stock. And then we can see that this is just list. Great. So let's go down and let's drill down into default. So one of the main sections that I wanted to show about default is there is an event. You can get a reference to the pivot, to the main pivot control, and then there is an event that allows you to know whenever the user changed the selected tab, and it is the selection change event. So here, every time that we are getting a new selection, we invoke the show method in our three tabs. So we set up the structure of this project as we have one file for every tab. So all the logic for the markets tab is here, for the news tab is here, and for the watch list. So every time the selection change is triggered, we look at the selected index, and then we call the appropriate show function.
Right. So this is essentially the main of your application. This is your app shell that's going to coordinate all of the logic between each of your pivot items.
Correct. So every application needs data. That is what makes it exciting. And in this case, we built a small Azure mobile service that is going to return JSON, and then so we can, for instance, look at the get stocks info, get stocks history, get news, get market. The way that this works is we are using something called win.js.hrr, which pretty much does an XML HTTP request to a URL, and then it returns a promise with the data. And then we can use this data and we can return it in the promise.
And so that's a pattern most applications are going to follow when they want to hook up to external services.
Correct.
Or hook up to Azure, and we're using mobile services as an example of how to leverage that.
Correct. So this in the screen right now, we have an example of the JSON object that is returned whenever we call get markets. And then we take that JSON object and then we return it whenever the tab needs the data to provide it to the binding list that is going to be displayed in the list view.
Right.
So if we look at the news tab, we saw earlier that the show method is getting called in the news whenever we switch to the news tab. The first thing we can notice is the markets tab shows an app bar, the watch list shows an app bar with different content. The news one doesn't need an app bar, so in this case we are hiding it. And then the first time that we get to this tab in the pivot control, we are making the call to get news, which, as we saw earlier, is a helper that returns a promise with items. And then we take those items and then we push into a binding list. As we mentioned earlier, the binding list is a proxy to a list. And we can see that the news, in this case, stocks.news.list, is configured in the news tab, in the news list, as the item data source, right there. So that is great. Let's look at.
Are you passing the stocks context in through your binding? Is that? I'm sorry, it's through your options. That's right.
Right.
Gotcha.
The list view has an item data source,
right,
and then it's configured the data
Perfect.
source.
Okay.
One other thing that we can also see, another interesting property in the list view, is the onItem invoked. Here we can see that it's calling this event handler, which we see here. So one of the interesting things with Cordova is that you can use plugins to be able to access device capabilities that you wouldn't necessarily be able to call from regular JavaScript.
Right.
And then they do the abstraction for you, and then they handle every platform that it supports. So in this case, whenever an item is invoked, we are calling the URL that particular item that was clicked, and then we open the system browser, as we can see here. Like, we don't have connection in this emulator. So let's go back to
Cool.
here, and
you use the Cordova plugin because not all HTML platforms support opening windows on that specific platform.
correct. If we actually look at every time that you do Cordova platform add iOS, they generate an Xcode project for you that also has the same structure. And you can actually see that in the case of iOS, that plugin added the CDB in browser.m and .h files that handle opening, interacting with the native API, right, that does the opening of the system browser. The market stub is very similar to what we just showed. The only difference here is that there is a little bit of extra logic to configure the upper. If we detect that the list is being displayed right now as a grid, we allow them to toggle and then display it as a list. So we have some logic that invokes an upper API called show-only commands, where you can narrow the set of commands that we had initially in the upper, all these commands,
right,
and then display only the ones that are appropriate for this particular scenario. When we go now to the watch list is the most complicated. No, it's not complicated. It's just a lot of more code because it does a lot. It handles retrieving the data, like in this show method. It handles retrieving the data for every chart, the historical data plus the info data, and then it handles edits. We can go ahead and say, oh, I want to edit the list and delete a particular stock. And then it also handles adding a stock. So we use a search box control. And then if we look at the code selected here, we have a suggestions requested event that gets triggered every time that we type something in the text box. So we can go and look at the code of what we're doing in this handler. This handler gets triggered. We look at the query that the user is currently typing. We have a pre-generated list of recommendations, and then we look to see if there is one of these is a substring of the suggestions, and if they are, we go ahead and we add it to the suggestions list of the search box control. Whenever a suggestion is chosen or a query is submitted by clicking on this search icon, we go ahead and call a handler called add stock handler, which we will see defined here. This section is pretty much going and using again our data helper, getting the stock information, these details for this particular stock, getting the history data for that particular stock, using promises to join the retrieval of those two pieces of information.
Because those are two separate network calls that you actually need to coordinate together. So once you have all of that information, you can then update the UI.
Exactly. And then we go ahead and add it to the list, and then we persist it here. We add it to the list, and then we persist it to local storage, just the symbol, the TSLA symbol. That way, the next time that the user launches the application again, they have the customized set of stocks that they added to the application.
And then the list that you're editing, that's the backing binding list to this specific list view in the watch list. And when you did that, we saw all of those, a fancy fade-in animation, and it pushed all of the other items down, and that was all done for you.
Correct.
And that's all done using CSS transforms, so it's hardware accelerated, and it works across all of the devices that we could target with WinJS.
Correct. We can also take a look at this. As soon as we added the stock, we call this helper show upper, which show this different set of commands. There is a handler for the edit that allows you to select particular items in the list. In this case, I'm selecting one. Whenever I click delete, we're going to see here that this delete selected handler gets called. We are going and getting the reference to that particular list view, this stocks list view.
Yep.
The list view has a property called selection, which allows you to get the indices of the items that are currently selected. So we go in descending order through those indices and delete them from the binding list, which internally is going to trigger notifications that the data change.
Yep.
And then the list view, if we do it right now, when I click delete, the list view is going to go ahead and play the animation and delete the item from the UI.
Yeah. Now I have a question for you. So a lot of the patterns that I'm seeing here is we're getting data from a server, we're wrapping that in some sort of observable collection, and then we're putting that in our UI. And so a lot of other JavaScript libraries that I've seen and I've worked with, and even in our own, we have this concept of a thing called a repeater, where you could build that same list view-like experience, using HTML primitives like unordered lists and things of that nature. What does the list view give you that's different than just stamping that out with your own repeater.
Right.
Control.
So the main, we always refer you to our main site that displays a list of the set of controls. One of the main assets that the list view, the main things that the list view gives you is the ability of visualization. You can imagine that you have a list of, or a data source that has 20,000 items, and then we obviously don't want to display have all those 20,000 items in the DOM.
Right. If I used a repeater, I would have 20,000 items actually in the DOM if I was to do that.
Exactly. So one of the main things in the list view, which makes it makes it more complex, but at the same time more powerful, is the fact that it handles visualizing the data for you. So in this case, even if we look at this scenario, we actually have 8 times 20, 116 items in this list. When we start scrolling, it looks like we actually have all of them in the DOM, but we actually don't. We actually only we calculate how many items fit in the viewport, and then we have extra pages, and we ensure that the panning performance is good. In addition to that, the list view also handles keyboarding for you. We want to make sure that all these controls are really high polished and they work well with touch, with keyboard, with mouse. There are other features in the list view, such as reordering content, and one of the main ones, you can do groups. You can have groups in your list. There are the option of creating multiple different layouts. In this stock sample, we were actually using list layouts and grid layout in all the scenarios, but you can actually even have the option to create a custom layout, and then the list view also handles animations for you whenever you change the binding list that is associated. When you use the repeater, you will see that it's stamping the content many times, but it doesn't necessarily give you visualization.
Right.
For your scenario.
Right, and so in your case, you thought to yourself, well, the end user could have as many, stock favorites if they wanted to, and so you preferred the open-ended virtual UI virtualized list as opposed to stamping out, and you wanted things like animations, and so you were able to just drop that in, use our models, and connect that up to some data, and we kind of the system or the framework took care of the rest for you. Cool.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Let's switch to the slides for a second.
Sure.
And let's go to
learn more. Awesome.
Yes.
So I think that concludes the demo. I mean, we could talk, endlessly about the type of JavaScript controls that we have available to you, but we actually would like to encourage you to actually participate with us.
Right.
And so our call to action is really take a look at Win.js. Go to our GitHub. File pull requests, issues you may find. If you're building a Cordova app, let us know. Let us know the platforms that you're targeting. We have a good browser matrix that we do our full-on. We do unit testing on every check-in to GitHub. But there might be some platforms that we haven't actually gotten to yet that Win.js might actually be running on. We just haven't had the time to test it yet.
Right.
But you may be writing your Cordova application targeting that specific mobile platform.
Right. We encourage you to go to our GitHub page. Again, Win.js is now open source. It's in GitHub. It is cross-platform. We're constantly creating many new different features. There are many exciting features coming in the future. Very recently, we added a content dialog control. If you have been tracking our commits, there was a split view control that went in the past week. So we really encourage you to use our GitHub page, file issues, ask questions, visit our Try Build Win.js site where you can have a playground and see in action how all the controls work, and again, ask us questions. We're really happy to always triage every issue and answer questions. We also have in the references in the slides, we also have link to our status page. Every time that we do a commit in GitHub, we actually automated the process of running all our unit tests in
Sauce Labs.
Sauce Labs, which is an open source solution. So it's very exciting. Every commit, we ran all our unit tests for every component in IE 10, IE 11, Safari, Firefox, iOS, Chrome.
Yeah.
So it's exciting stuff.
Yeah, and the one last thing that we like to show you is that since Edgar has been doing everything in Cordova, and since we're actually just running an HTML5 JavaScript application, you can take that exact same code and deploy it to a website. And so here we actually have the Stocks app running full in a web browser, and this works across IE, Firefox, in Safari on Mac. And so this is really kind of the first look at doing HTML5 development, deploying it to web properties, deploying it to mobile devices using Apache Cordova. And we think this is really exciting. We're making lots of progress. And we would love to have you guys contribute, talk to us on Twitter, Stack Overflow, all of the regular spots for developer questions. And so with that, we're going to wrap up this module. And we hope that you stay tuned for the next module. We're going to talk a little bit about more cross-platform development. Some WebGL is on the way. And so we just like to, on behalf of the entire WinJS team, we'd like to thank you and take WinJS for a try. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, welcome back.
Welcome back, guys. Happy to be there.
Yeah, the last part of the day, an introduction to WebGL, 3D, and Babylon.js with David. So let's go. I'm still Eric, you know.
Yeah, and I'm still David. For those who didn't know me, I'm program manager for Microsoft DX, Developer Experience, and I'm more focused around Open Web Standard and IE. But today, and for this specific session, I'm here because I am the author, the father of...
the father, yeah.
Father, yeah, that's exactly the term. It's my baby. Yeah. And of a free open source framework called Babylon.js that I will present soon.
Okay, so the agenda for this last session, it's one, using 3D accelerated graphics with HTML5 and of course WebGL.
Yes.
Using Babylon to get a ride on WebGL complexity.
Yep.
And performance consideration, because it's something really important.
Yeah, it's about cross-platform. So we have to deal with different quality of hardware from low end to high end. So we will have to discuss a bit at the end. It will be perhaps a little bit complex, but we have to discuss that.
Yeah, but it's still a very interesting subject to know.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay, so 3D accelerated graphics with HTML5 and WebGL across devices, that make a lot of sense to invite you and to finish the day with that.
Thank you.
Cross-platform, it's about HTML5 all the day. And yes, HTML5 is live today. Okay, so what is WebGL?
Yeah, it's a good question. What's WebGL?
Yes, a good question. So it's a JavaScript API.
Yes.
So that makes sense to have it today. It's based on OpenGL Embedded System 2.0.
Yes.
It's standardized by Cron's Group, and it works perfectly well in Cordova, as I demonstrated this morning.
Yeah, you did a blog about that using Babylon.js into a Cordova application that works pretty well.
Oh yeah, that was pretty well on Windows Phone, on Android, on the Firefox OS. I just tested last week, and of course iOS.
Yeah, since iOS 8, WebGL is now almost on all modern, let's say, small devices.
Yeah. So that makes sense to have this discussion about WebGL now. Using WebGL directly, it's possible, of course, everything is possible, but you have to handle everything except the rendering. So you have to manage a render loop, handle the texture and all the resource management, create the geometry, topology, and of course create shader code. And sometimes shader code is not so easy. Yeah?
Because when we want to deal with this kind of low-level API, you have to be good at math, you have to be good at GLSL, which is the language used by the shaders. Yeah. You have to perfectly understand how the GPU and the CPU are communicating, how the memory bandwidth is used, and that's not easy. It's really, really low level. Yeah. It's like wanting to create your own car, but just based on some trash of metal. You have a bit of metal, you have a bit of gas, and you have to create your car.
Yeah, not so easy.
Yeah, that's not easy.
Yeah. That's why perhaps we can see a demo about that.
I think I can show you how WebGL is working if you want. Okay, so I prepared for you guys a small project